In 2019, a woman named Linda Everett sat in her doctor's office in Columbus, Ohio, and received a diagnosis that would define the next chapter of her life: type 2 diabetes. Her doctor was kind, professional, thorough. He explained her condition clearly, gave her a detailed treatment plan, and handed her 3 separate prescriptions before she left: a medication to manage her blood sugar, a medication to manage the side effects of the first medication, and a third medication to manage the cardiovascular risk that came with her condition. Linda was not unusual. Linda was not unlucky. Linda was a Tuesday, because in America today approximately 130 million adults have diabetes or prediabetes. 37 million have been formally diagnosed, and the pharmaceutical industry generates approximately $50 billion annually from diabetes medications alone, not from curing diabetes, from treating it, month after month, year after year, prescription after prescription, for the rest of Linda's life. Now here is the question that this video is going to sit with for the next 15 minutes. A question that is not comfortable, that the pharmaceutical industry spends billions of dollars preventing you from asking seriously. If the science to meaningfully prevent and in many cases reverse type 2 diabetes through lifestyle intervention has existed for decades, and is documented in peer-reviewed medical literature, available to every physician in America, why is the dominant treatment model one of lifetime pharmaceutical management, rather than aggressive prevention and reversal? The answer to that question is not medical, it is financial. And once you understand the financial architecture of the American pharmaceutical industry, you will never hear the word treatment the same way again. To understand how Big Pharma became the most profitable industry in the history of American capitalism, you need to understand the difference between 2 words that sound similar, but represent completely different business models. The 2 words are treatment and cure. A treatment is something you take repeatedly over time to manage a condition. A cure is something that eliminates the condition entirely. From a purely medical perspective, cures are obviously preferable. From a purely financial perspective, treatments are infinitely more valuable. A cure generates revenue once. A treatment generates revenue every single month for the rest of a patient's life. A hepatitis C drug that cures the disease in 12 weeks generates approximately $84,000 in revenue per patient one time. A diabetes medication that manages blood sugar without curing the underlying condition generates approximately $3,000 per patient per year for 30 or 40 years. That is $120,000 over a lifetime from a single patient with a single condition. Multiply that by 37 million diagnosed diabetics in America alone, and the mathematics of why the pharmaceutical industry structures its research priorities around chronic disease management, rather than acute cure, become impossible to ignore. This is not a secret. It is not hidden. It is the fundamental economic logic of an industry that answers first to shareholders and second to patients. And understanding that order of priority is the beginning of understanding everything that follows. The research and development pipeline of the American pharmaceutical industry tells this story with extraordinary clarity, if you know how to read it. The United States spends more on healthcare per capita than any other nation on earth. Americans pay the highest prices for prescription drugs of any developed country. And the pharmaceutical industry consistently ranks among the most profitable sectors of the entire American economy, with net profit margins that regularly exceed 20%. Where does that money go? The industry's standard answer is research and development. We charge high prices because drug development is expensive and risky, and the profits fund the next generation of treatments. This argument sounds reasonable. It is also, when examined carefully, significantly misleading. A 2019 study published in JAMA Internal Medicine analyzed the research and development spending of the largest pharmaceutical companies versus their marketing and administrative spending. The findings were striking. The companies studied spent on average more on marketing and administration than on research and development. More money was spent convincing doctors to prescribe existing drugs and convincing patients to ask for them than was spent discovering new ones. And within the research and development spending that did occur, the allocation of resources tells its own story. Drugs for chronic conditions that require lifetime management consistently receive more research investment than drugs for acute conditions that can be resolved. Treatments for conditions common in wealthy developed countries receive dramatically more investment than treatments for diseases that predominantly affect poorer populations. The research follows the profit, not the need, and the profit follows the treatment model, not the cure. The relationship between the pharmaceutical industry and the medical system that is supposed to independently serve patients is one of the most thoroughly documented conflicts of interest in the history of American institutions. And it operates at every level of the system simultaneously. Start with the FDA. The Food and Drug Administration is the federal agency responsible for approving pharmaceutical drugs before they can be sold to the American public. Its mandate is to protect public health by ensuring the safety and efficacy of medications. Its funding model creates a structural conflict with that mandate that the industry has exploited with extraordinary effectiveness. Under the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, first passed in 1992, and renewed multiple times since, pharmaceutical companies pay fees to the FDA to fund the review of their own drug applications. Approximately 65% of the FDA's drug review budget now comes from the pharmaceutical industry it is supposed to independently regulate. The FDA has become financially dependent on the fees paid by the companies whose products it approves. This does not mean every FDA approval is corrupt. Many approved drugs are safe and effective, but it creates a structural incentive toward approval, rather than rejection, that independent researchers have documented in studies showing faster approval times, higher approval rates, and more post-market safety issues with drugs approved under the user fee model compared to historical baselines. The regulator is funded by the regulated. This is the first floor of a building whose architecture was designed by the industry it was supposed to constrain. The second floor is the physician relationship. For decades, the pharmaceutical industry operated one of the most sophisticated physician influence programs ever built. Detail representatives. Pharmaceutical sales professionals whose entire job was to visit doctors, leave samples, provide meals, sponsor continuing medical education, and build relationships that subtly shape prescribing behavior toward the company's products. At its peak, the pharmaceutical industry employed approximately one sales representative for every 5 physicians in America. One for every 5. The gifts were modest enough to feel like professional courtesy: lunches, conference sponsorships, speaker fees for physicians who agreed to present at industry-sponsored educational events. A study published in PLOS Medicine found that physicians who received even a single industry-sponsored meal were significantly more likely to prescribe that company's brand name drug over a generic equivalent. Not because the brand name drug was better, because a relationship had been established. Because reciprocity is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology, and the pharmaceutical industry understood this decades before the behavioral economists named it. The most aggressive version of this influence program was not subtle gifts and lunches. It was direct payment. Thousands of American physicians received speaking fees, consulting fees, and research funding from pharmaceutical companies whose products they were simultaneously prescribing and recommending to colleagues. ProPublica maintains a public database called Dollars for Docs that tracks payments from pharmaceutical companies to physicians. In a single recent year, it documented over $2 billion in payments from pharmaceutical companies to American doctors. $2 billion flowing from the industry to the people whose prescribing decisions determine its revenue. Then there is the patent system. The legal architecture that transforms a molecule discovered, often with significant public research funding, into a decades-long private monopoly that allows pharmaceutical companies to charge whatever the market will bear with no competitive pressure whatsoever. When a pharmaceutical company develops a new drug, it receives a patent that gives it the exclusive right to manufacture and sell that drug for 20 years. During that patent period, the company can charge any price it chooses. There is no government body in the United States with the authority to say the price is too high. This is unique among developed nations. Every other major developed country has some mechanism for negotiating or regulating drug prices. The United States does not. The result is price disparities that are not marginal. They are grotesque. Insulin, a medication discovered in 1921 whose patent was sold to the University of Toronto for $1 by its inventors because they believed it should be available to everyone, costs on average 10 times more in the United States than in Canada. The same molecule, the same drug, manufactured by the same companies, 10 times the price because one country negotiates and one does not. Humira, a rheumatoid arthritis drug made by AbbVie, generated more revenue in the United States in a single year than the entire GDP of many small countries. Its list price in America is approximately $77,000 per year. In Germany, the same drug costs approximately $20,000 per year. The patent system as it operates in American pharmaceutical markets is not primarily a mechanism for rewarding innovation. It is a mechanism for sustaining monopoly pricing in the world's largest and least regulated pharmaceutical market for the maximum possible period of time. But the most revealing chapter of this story is what happens to the drugs that actually could eliminate the need for lifetime pharmaceutical management. Because they exist. The science is real. The evidence is documented. And the pattern of what happens to that evidence inside the American medical and pharmaceutical system is one of the most important and least discussed stories in modern American healthcare. The landmark Diabetes Prevention Program study conducted by the National Institutes of Health and published in 2002 demonstrated that intensive lifestyle intervention combining dietary change and moderate exercise reduced the progression from prediabetes to type 2 diabetes by 58%. More effective than the leading pharmaceutical intervention at the time, 58% reduction, through diet and exercise alone. That study was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. It was covered by major media. It was widely discussed in medical circles. And then the healthcare system largely continued doing what it had always done, prescribing medication. Because lifestyle intervention programs are difficult to bill for. Insurance reimbursement for intensive dietary counseling and lifestyle coaching is minimal compared to reimbursement for prescribing a medication. A physician who spends 30 minutes counseling a patient on dietary changes that could prevent diabetes earns a fraction of what they earn writing the prescription for the drug that manages it. The financial architecture of American healthcare does not reward prevention. It rewards treatment. And it does so consistently, structurally, and at scale in ways that shape the behavior of every participant in the system regardless of their individual intentions or ethics. The opioid crisis is the most catastrophic and the most transparent example of what happens when pharmaceutical profit motive operates without sufficient constraint. Purdue Pharma introduced OxyContin in 1996. It was a powerful opioid painkiller with a time-release formula that Purdue claimed made it less addictive than existing opioids. That claim was false. Purdue knew it was false. Internal documents that later became public showed company executives were aware very early that OxyContin was being crushed and snorted to defeat the time-release mechanism. Were aware that patients were becoming addicted. Were aware that diversion and abuse were widespread. And continued aggressively marketing the drug anyway. Purdue deployed a sales force that visited physicians with messaging about OxyContin's safety profile that the company knew was misleading. They used patient satisfaction surveys that incentivized physicians to prescribe more pain medication. They funded pain advocacy organizations that lobbied for broader opioid prescribing guidelines. They built a system specifically designed to maximize prescriptions of a drug they knew was destroying lives. The result was 500,000 American deaths from opioid overdose between 1999 and 2019. 500,000 people. The Sackler family that owned Purdue Pharma extracted approximately $10 to $12 billion from the company during the years the crisis was building. They paid fines. They restructured the company. They eventually agreed to a bankruptcy settlement. But the fundamental accountability that 500,000 deaths would seem to demand, the criminal prosecution of the individuals who made the decisions that caused those deaths, never came. Because the system that was supposed to deliver that accountability had been so thoroughly shaped by pharmaceutical industry influence that it could not bring itself to follow the evidence to its obvious conclusion. So what does this mean for you? The person watching this video who takes medication, who has a chronic condition, who trusts their doctor, who uses the American healthcare system because it is the only healthcare system available to them. It does not mean your medications are unnecessary. It does not mean your doctor is corrupt. It does not mean every pharmaceutical company is evil. The American pharmaceutical industry has produced genuine miracles. Vaccines that eliminated diseases that killed millions. Treatments that turned HIV from a death sentence into a manageable chronic condition. Cancer therapies that have extended and saved millions of lives. The problem is not that pharmaceutical companies do good things. The problem is that the financial architecture surrounding those good things has created incentives so powerful and so systematically embedded in every layer of the healthcare system that they distort medical research priorities, physician prescribing behavior, regulatory decision-making, and public health policy in ways that consistently favor treatment over prevention, chronic management over cure, and pharmaceutical intervention over lifestyle intervention regardless of what the evidence says about relative effectiveness. What it means for you practically is this. Ask questions your doctor may not volunteer answers to. Ask whether there is a lifestyle intervention with evidence behind it for your condition before accepting that medication is the only option. Ask whether the medication being prescribed is brand name when a generic equivalent exists. Research whether your physician has received payments from the company that manufactures what they are prescribing. Not because every physician who accepts industry payment is compromised, but because you deserve to make decisions about your own body with full information about every factor that might be shaping the advice you receive. Here is the final truth about Big Pharma and the American healthcare system. The system does not need to be consciously malevolent to produce malevolent outcomes. It does not require a boardroom of villains deciding to keep Americans sick on purpose. It only requires a financial architecture where the most profitable outcome is a patient who is managed but never cured. Where the incentives for research flow toward treatments rather than cures. Where the regulators are funded by the regulated. Where the prescribers are influenced by the manufacturers. Where the patent system guarantees monopoly pricing with no upper limit. Where prevention is structurally undervalued compared to treatment. Where the politicians who could change any of this receive more campaign contributions from the pharmaceutical industry than from any other sector of the American economy. When every incentive in a system points in the same direction, you do not need conspiracy. You need only to follow the money and watch the outcomes it produces. The outcomes are 130 million Americans with diabetes or prediabetes, 500,000 dead from opioids, drug prices that force ordinary Americans to ration insulin, a healthcare system that consumes 18% of the entire American economy, and produces health outcomes that rank below almost every other developed nation by almost every meaningful measure. This is not a healthcare system optimized for health. It is a healthcare system optimized for revenue. And until the financial architecture changes, the medical outcomes will not change either. Because in America, as in everything else, the system produces exactly what it is designed to produce. And right now it is designed to treat you, not to cure you. Understanding that difference is the most important medical education you will ever receive.